we're going to lay off half of our staff because this thing doesn't work efficiently. The practical impact of that is death. And that's what we're talking about. And so every time we talk about the practical, near-term, immediate, real-world, geopolitical, and humanitarian impacts of what has happened, especially to USAID, you pivot very skillfully and maybe even correctly to what needs to be reformed in the State Department itself and in the interaction and relationship between aid and state. That's not what I'm asking you.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you. Just to follow up on Senator Collins' line of questioning, I guess the analogy is, say a hospital that's running inefficiently, and a turnaround guy comes in and says, I got a plan for reorganizing this hospital. We're going to do delivery system reform. We're going to use technology. We're going to be aggressive. We're going to be fearless. And in the meantime, we're going to lay off half of our staff because this thing doesn't work efficiently. The practical impact of that is death. And that's what we're talking about. And so every time we talk about the practical, near-term, immediate, real-world, geopolitical, and humanitarian impacts of what has happened, especially to USAID, you pivot very skillfully and maybe even correctly to what needs to be reformed in the State Department itself and in the interaction and relationship between aid and state. That's not what I'm asking you about. I'm asking you about why in the world we wouldn't do this in the regular order. In order to put USAID under the State Department and better align it, we need a statute. In order to reform all of these programs, we need an SFOPS bill. You can't just come in and light the place on fire and say, well, it was a mess. And so I just want to understand what's the path forward, because people really are dying. It's not as though Catholic Relief Services or CARE or the World Food Program are a bunch of leftists coming out and complaining about everything that's happening because they want to get you. This is actually happening. People are vacating where they work, and then in some instances the Chinese government comes in and provides the exact same service, not a similar service, but the same program. They just do it. We'll do it. And then in some instances nobody does it, and as a result people die. And so I'm just wondering, where do you think the path forward is for us to work Article 1, Article 2, former colleagues, to get this thing back on track?
Well, I think the first path is, let me just say on the regular order part, sure, we want to do that. It would be great to make all these things statutory and codify them. That would be ideal. I will say I was a member of this body for, 6, 12, 30, 40, 16 years, and we always talked about doing it by regular order. We never got to it. So now's the time to do it because we really have to do it now. The second point I would make is the U.S. is going to continue to be a very generous donor for humanity. I would venture to guess that for the rest of our lifetime, no nation on earth, if we can still afford it, no nation on earth will continue to do more for humanitarian assistance, for food and medicine and life-saving services, and even for developmental assistance. But I also think we have to recognize this. We cannot continue to be the foreign aid provider for everyone on everything. We just can't do it. We can't do it efficiently, and we cannot afford to do it either. And if we're going to, we do not have unlimited resources. And so we've now entered an era, particularly of geopolitics, where we have to be very careful about where we invest our money, where we provide aid. Humanitarian systems aside, okay, you have a mudslide somewhere, an earthquake, a hurricane, and we're going to help people. I don't know how much we would want necessarily geopolitics to play into those sorts of decisions.
What's the proposed budget cut in the humanitarian accounts?
Well, it's not the humanitarian account right now. Basically, the rest of it is reflected at over 50% in the proposed amount that you have right now before you. But we believe that we can provide these essential services while reducing some of the redundancies that were happening through this, for lack of a better term, this foreign aid industrial complex. Some of these projects, I think you understand this perhaps better than most, some of these projects had a prime contractor who had a sub, who had a sub, who had a sub, who had a sub, who had a local provider. That's crazy. That's lunacy. Why do I need 6 subs to pass one to the other to ultimately get it down to the ground? I think we can get it maybe from the prime to the sub, in some cases directly to the group on the ground through our embassy. Our embassy can say, we want to provide food in this community, here's the best people to do it, and I can avoid all those layers of NGOs.
Part of the problem, right, is our tolerance for risk. Because if we establish a bunch of criteria and requirements and pre-audit, then you increase administrative costs, right? And I'm one of these people who thinks that it's not unreasonable to start to capitate or slowly ramp down administrative costs. But administrative costs are not 88%, right? That 12% versus the rest of it cut is what money goes to local NGOs in Africa or Asia or Pacific Islands or wherever. And we should be increasing that number, and we have been increasing that number. But it is the precipitousness with which this is all being done that is actually causing reputational damage. A lot of us are doing CODELs, and when we sort of go overseas and we sort of, temporarily take off our partisan hats, we interact with the same providers, and we see kids on half rations getting smaller and smaller. We see kids getting HIV/AIDS from their parents, and nothing you said, in order to implement anything that you're talking about, is it necessary for us to allow children to die? And yet that is what's happening. And so can we please separate these two questions of should we reform the State Department, should we reform the foreign aid enterprise, and should we do it in such a catastrophically unlawful way that people around the world die and people come to believe that they can't believe that America is a reliable partner anymore. And so if we can please separate these questions and get to writing a bill, I think the country will be better for it.
The moment lands heavy in the chamber when Senator Brian Schatz refuses to let the conversation drift into abstractions. He brings it back to consequences, not projections, not theories, consequences. He describes a system abruptly dismantled, not through legislation or deliberation, but through sudden decisions that ripple outward into real lives. His words cut through the procedural language of Washington with a blunt moral clarity. When support systems vanish overnight, the result is not efficiency. It is loss. And that loss is already happening. This exchange reveals something fundamental about how power operates when urgency collides with ideology. On one side, Schatz insists on the reality unfolding beyond the walls of the hearing room. He speaks of programs collapsing midstream, of organizations pulling out, of services evaporating in regions where they were the only lifeline. On the other, Senator Marco Rubio acknowledges the ambition of reform, but frames it within the limits of resources, bureaucracy, and geopolitical competition. Two visions emerge, not simply of foreign policy, but of responsibility itself. At the center of this moment is a question the hearing never quite resolves. Can a government pursue reform without causing irreversible damage along the way? Schatz argues that reform done recklessly is not reform at all. He invokes the image of a hospital stripped of staff in the name of efficiency, leaving those inside to suffer the consequences. The metaphor is deliberate and devastating. It reframes budget cuts not as numbers on a spreadsheet, but as decisions with immediate human cost. Rubio responds with a familiar argument in Washington. He speaks of redundancy, of inefficiency, of an aid system layered with contractors passing funds through endless chains before reaching communities on the ground. He is not wrong about the complexity. The foreign aid apparatus has grown tangled over decades, shaped by risk aversion, compliance rules, and political compromise. Rubio points to a system that often spends too much to deliver too little, too slowly. In his view, reform is overdue, and delay has its own cost. But what this exchange exposes is the danger of collapsing long-term reform into short-term disruption. Schatz presses the point again and again. Reform through statute, through regular order, through cooperation between Congress and the executive branch. Not reform by shock, not reform by sudden withdrawal. Because while lawmakers debate structures and efficiencies, trust is being eroded in real time. Partners abroad are watching commitments dissolve without warning. Vacuums are forming, and in some cases, other global powers are stepping in to fill them. This is where the hearing moves beyond policy and into the realm of credibility. Schatz warns that when programs disappear overnight, America's word begins to mean less. Not because reform is wrong, but because unpredictability is corrosive. Nations that once relied on stable partnerships begin to hedge. Local organizations lose confidence. Entire regions reassess who they can depend on when crises emerge. The damage is not only immediate, it is strategic. Rubio acknowledges reputational risk, but returns to the limits of American capacity. The United States, he argues, cannot be everything to everyone forever. Resources are finite. Priorities must be set. In an era of intense global competition, aid must be aligned with national interest as well as humanitarian impulse. This is the tension that defines modern American foreign policy: generosity versus sustainability, leadership versus restraint. Yet Schatz's final challenge lingers unanswered. He asks whether any of the reforms being proposed truly require allowing preventable suffering to occur in the meantime. Whether it is possible or acceptable to separate the goal of fixing a system from the manner in which that fix is imposed. His voice carries frustration, not just with the outcome, but with the process. Laws exist for a reason. Oversight exists for a reason. And when those safeguards are bypassed, even good intentions can lead to devastating outcomes. This moment in the hearing is not about partisan theatrics. It is about accountability, about whether power can slow itself down long enough to measure the impact of its actions, about whether urgency becomes an excuse to sidestep democratic process, and about whether reform, when done without care, undermines the very values it claims to protect. What we see here is a microcosm of a larger American dilemma. A nation grappling with its role in a changing world. A government pulled between fiscal pressure at home and moral responsibility abroad. Leaders who agree that the system is broken, but disagree sharply on how it can be and how fast to fix it. And caught in the middle are people far from this chamber whose lives are shaped by decisions made in rooms like this one. As the hearing draws to a close, one truth remains unavoidable. Policy is never abstract. Budgets are never just numbers. And reform, no matter how necessary, carries weight when it is enacted without deliberation. The strength of a democracy is not measured only by its willingness to change, but by its ability to change without abandoning those who depend on it. This is the moment Brian Schatz forced into the open. Not a soundbite, not a slogan, a reckoning, and it is a reminder that leadership is not only about cutting what doesn't work. It is about preserving what must not be lost in the process. If you believe transparency matters, if you believe accountability matters, and if you believe these moments deserve more than silence, support our work to expose the truth. Subscribe to Liberty Report USA.